That's after the second temple?
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
You said that's after the second temple they're not allowed to?
Yeah, we'll go back to the Mishnah, which is on the end of the last part of 9b. And we'll
Okay.
just start with that. Okay, so let me pull up the screen so we can see what we're doing here. All right, so wait, no, you got to do this. You can, okay, so the Mishnah. So the Mishnah started with, again, this, we're still in this formula of Ein Bain X LOI. So Ein Bain Shiloh, Yerushalayim, Ella B'Shilo Ochlin Kodeshim Kalim, U'Maser Sheni B'Chol HaRoeh, U'Yerushalayim Lifnim Min HaChoma. So the only difference between the tabernacle that was in Shiloh, which was before the temple was built, quite some time before the temple was built, there were some temporary stops in between. But the only difference between the Shiloh tabernacle and the temple in Jerusalem is that in Shiloh, one could eat offerings of lesser sanctity, and we'll see what that is. Offerings of lesser sanctity. Oh, it doesn't tell us what this lesser sanctity is, but it's basically like your personal, like we've seen shlamim, wholeness offerings, usually things that people brought on their own for an offering. You could eat those types of sacrifices. Oh, here, it tells you right here. Peace offering, shlamim are really better wholeness offering, well-being offerings. Todot, Thanksgiving offerings. The Paschal lamb, that's the, for Pesach. So basically anything that the offerers were eating. And the second tithe, that's the Maser Sheni, which is the tithe that you give after you've given the tithe to the priests and the Levites, their portions, then you take another tenth, whatever you have left, and you would either go to Jerusalem and eat it, or you would exchange it for coins and then bring the money to Jerusalem and buy the food there. So that's the second tithe. Some years you would do that, and some years with the second tithe, it was actually called the poor person's tithe. We would give it to the poor in the community. So, but anyway, the food that you would eat in Jerusalem, the second, or near the tabernacle, the second tithe, and those offerings that the offerer can eat, the lesser sanctity offerings, you can eat it any place that overlooks Shiloh, as Shiloh is not a walled city. So it's really anywhere in the area. Let's see what the notes are here. Other than the temple in Jerusalem, the divine presence rested in three places in Eretz Yisrael: Shiloh, Nov and Givon, and the temple. Okay. According to the Gemara in Tractate Devachim, the tabernacle stood in Shiloh for 369 years. That's a pretty long time. And Nov and Givon for 57 years. The city of Shiloh is located in the tribal land of Ephraim, and is 35 kilometers north of Jerusalem on an ancient mountain ridge. Okay, so it's kind of interesting then. Again, you have this competition between Ephraim, that is Joseph's tribes, and Judah, which was Jerusalem. Jerusalem is in Judah. So you have that the competition even among the tabernacles. All right. So since Shiloh was not a walled city, that basically anywhere that overlooked Shiloh, you could eat it. That was considered the boundary. In Jerusalem, one eats it only within the walls of Jerusalem. V'kan kodshei kodeshim nechalim lifnim min haklaim. So here in Shiloh and there in Jerusalem, offerings of the most sacred order, that's the like chatat and an asham, these were the things that the priests had to eat, are eaten only within the offering, within the most holy. The tabernacle courtyard in Shiloh was surrounded by hangings, and the temple courtyard in Jerusalem was surrounded by another wall. So here's another difference. With regard to the sanctity of Shiloh, Yesh Acharecha heter. After that tabernacle was destroyed, there was permission to sacrifice offerings on improvised altars. But after the destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, there was no more permission to offer sacrificial offerings. So according to the Mishnah, after Shiloh was destroyed, there were places that people could offer, even if they didn't go to the public altar. There was permission to create other sacred altars and give up the offerings. Whereas after Jerusalem, this is where I missed the word not, there was no permission to sacrifice any offerings. And of course, we don't do that and we don't make offerings anymore. Although we'll see that's not universally agreed upon. All right, so the Gemara starts, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Shamati shemakrivin beveit chonyo bazman hazeh. I heard, according to Rabbi Yitzchak, that one could bring sacrifices in the temple of Onias, Beit Chonyo, which was in Egypt at the present time. The Gemara cites the basis for this statement of Rabbi Yitzchak. He maintains that the temple of Onias is not a house of idol worship, but rather a temple devoted to the service of God, and he maintains that the initial consecration sanctified Jerusalem for its time, but not forever. That meant that after the destruction of the temple, the sanctity of Jerusalem lapsed and the sacrifice of offerings elsewhere was not prohibited. For these reasons, it was permitted to sacrifice offerings in the temple of Onias after the temple was destroyed. Now, this is a really interesting part of Jewish history. And I wrote this in the notes, that from 170 before the Common Era to 73 of the Common Era, so even after the destruction of the temple, there was another temple in Egypt, a priest named Onias III, or some people think it was Onias IV, so a little confusion. Josephus writes about this, the famous Roman historian, Jewish Roman historian, that this guy Onias, this priest named Onias, either the third or the fourth, fled to Egypt because of infighting among the priests, and he requested from Ptolemy and Cleopatra permission to build a temple. And his was the only other place that sacrifices were offered. The temple was destroyed by Vespasian in 73, the same guy who destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, because he was concerned that after defeating the Jews in Israel, this temple might become a center of rebellion. So it's interesting. There wasn't just one place where Jews were offering up sacrifice. We'll talk about this tomorrow night in the history class, because the whole question of when did prayer liturgy develop? And it has to do with the growing diaspora of the Jewish people, Jewish population centers outside the land of Israel. But here we had for almost 250 years, right? 243 years, you had this alternative temple in a foreign country, where Jews were offering sacrifices. Very unusual. That was because unlike most pagan religions, when the pagan moved from his central city, wherever the cult was based, it wasn't unusual for them to offer sacrifices in their new town to their gods. That works in a polytheistic system. There's a lot of different gods. These are my gods. These are your gods. We all got gods. But in the monotheistic system, there's only one place that's acceptable for prayer, for sacrifices, and for worship, or the highest form of worship, I guess. And Jews did not participate in that. So this was an anomaly that they had with Onias. Anyway, okay, so there's a little bit of historical interest there. In any case, this is what Rabbi Yitzchak taught. So the point is that there were places that you could sacrifice even after the temple was destroyed. Dichtiv ki lovatem ad ata hamenucha ve'el hanachala. What's the source of this halacha? It's this verse from Deuteronomy, for you are not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance. They interpret this as rest, Minucha was Shiloh, Nachala was Jerusalem. The verse juxtaposes Nachala to Minucha, the two places. Just as in Ma Minucha Yesh Acharecha Heter, just as in the place of rest, that is, just as in Shiloh, there was permission to sacrifice after permission to sacrifice on improvised altars, so too in the Nachala, the Jerusalem, after its destruction, there was permission to sacrifice offerings on improvised altars. That's at least how this halacha went. But this obviously wasn't the majority view. Amrule, Amrat, Amar lehu lo. So the other sages confronted Rabbi Yitzchak. Did you actually say this halacha with regard to the temple of Onias? And he said to them, no, I didn't say that. Now this was problematic because Rava, a student, said, wait a minute, not only did he say it, I learned it from him, but then he retracted his ruling. Let's see what the note is. The Rashba, Rabbi, what's his name? Shimon ben Asvili, writes that there's no definitive proof from here that Rabbi Yitzchak completely retracted his opinion. In other places in the Gemara, there are cases where one of the sages learned a certain matter from his teachers. When that matter was challenged from various sources, although he continued to hold in accordance with what he had received, rather than enter into a debate over the matter, he attempted to evade the challenge by saying that he never said it. But according to the Rashba, that there's no proof that he did retract his opinion. And you notice that this is Rava who's saying that he learned it from him. It's Steinsaltz's interpretation that he retracted the ruling. So we don't really know if Rabbi Yitzchak retracted it. The question is, why did he say it and then say, no, I never said it? Anyway, my time kaha darbe. So the Gemara assumes that he did retract his ruling. He said he didn't say it. So it believes that he said it and then retracted. Mishum kasha de Rabbi Mari. Okay, it was because of a kasha, a challenge raised by Rav Mari. As Rav Mari raised an objection from the Mishnah. With regard to the sanctity of Shiloh, after the tabernacle was destroyed, there is permission to sacrifice offerings on improvised altars. But with regard to the sanctity of Jerusalem, this is right. The Mishnah says there is no permission, and furthermore, after to continue sacrificing. So we had the Mishnah itself is challenging this idea that you could. And furthermore, we learned in a Mishnah from Zvachim that once they came to Jerusalem, that is the people returned to Jerusalem, they prohibited these altars, Jerusalem from Babylonia. They prohibited the altars and they did not again have permission to do so. And Jerusalem became Haita, Vehi Haita leNachala. And that's what it means that it was a Nachala, not to compare Nachala to Minucha, but rather Nachala was different. It was an eternal, it was an everlasting inheritance. It was totally different than Shiloh. Now, Tana Ehi. So then, therefore, what's the distinction between those who argue that Jerusalem's holiness was not eternal because it was that sanctity left with its destruction, just like the sanctity of Shiloh was not forever and ended with its destruction, and those who argue, oh no, Jerusalem is different. Its sanctity is eternal. So it was once again, we've seen this before. It was a dispute between earlier scholars, the Tanaim. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, or we're going to say it's an assumption. It's an assumption that they're making. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Shamati shahayu bonim behechal osin klaim lehechal uklaim laazara. according to Rabbi Eliezer, I heard that when they were building the sanctuary in the Second Temple, Jerusalem's been destroyed. The people have been exiled to Babylonia for approximately 70 years. They then return when Persia conquers Babylonia, and the Persians allow the Jews to come back and encourage them to rebuild the temple. So when I heard when they were building the sanctuary for the Second Temple, they fashioned temporary hangings for the sanctuary and temporary hangings for the courtyard to serve as partitions and construction of the stone until the walls were completed. The difference was only in that in building the sanctuary, the workers built the walls outside the hangings without entering, and in the courtyard, the workers built the walls inside the hangings. Rabbi Yehoshua's response was, Shamati shemakrivim af al pi she'ein bayit. I heard that one sacrifices offerings on the altar, even though there is no temple. One eats offerings of the most sacred order in the temple courtyard, even if there are no hangings. And one eats offerings of lesser sanctity and second tithe produce in Jerusalem, even if there is no wall surrounding the city, due to the fact that the initial consecration sanctified Jerusalem for its time and also sanctified Jerusalem forever. So even if you don't have walls built, according to Rabbi Yoshua, sanctity for Jerusalem is there. And you can build up Bamot while you don't have a temple and make offerings, because that sanctity is different in Jerusalem. It's an eternal sanctity once it was consecrated. So what the Gemara concludes from these two statements is that Rabbi Yehoshua based his opinion on the principle that the initial sanctification sanctified Jerusalem forever. And they inferred from what Rabbi Eliezer was holding that it did not sanctify Jerusalem forever. Meaning, because what he's saying here is they needed to put up some kind of structure in the sanctuary to make the sanctuary, the newly built or the building in process of the sanctuary in Jerusalem, to make it functional. Without those temporary hangings, and then eventually the walls, you couldn't make offerings, or rather, right, you couldn't make offerings because the functional sanctity of Jerusalem had lost its power. It had lost its functionality because once the temple was destroyed, so was the sanctity, in a sense, put on hold until a new temple could be restored. That's the inference with the idea of they're putting hangings. They had to put up hangings, temporary hangings in the courtyard so they could start making sacrifices, even though the temple wasn't completely built. Rabbi Yeshua says, no, you don't even need the hangings. You could just do it because Jerusalem's sanctity is different. That's how they're understanding the two Tannaitic opinions. But Ravina is going to challenge this inference of Rabbi Eliezer. Mimai, where do you get the idea that Rabbi Eliezer was holding that the sanctity wasn't eternal? Perhaps both sages, everyone agrees that initial consecration sanctified Jerusalem for its time and forever. The Kule Alma Kedusha Rishona, that early sanctity, that first sanctity, Kidusha sanctified it, the Sha'ata, for the moment, Vikitsha Latid Lavo, and for the future. And one sage, the only difference was that one sage, Rabbi Eliezer, stated that this tradition, which he heard from his teachers, and the other sage stated a tradition that he heard from his teachers. And if you would say, why then do they need hangings at all, according to Rabbi Eliezer? So, well, I mean, why else would Rabbi Eliezer say that you needed the hangings in the sanctuary, in a sense, to begin the functioning of the sanctuary with sacrifices? Why else, if not that's what was required to allow and permit sacrifices to be made? Well, maybe there was another reason for the hangings. It was merely for seclusion, right? They didn't want everybody looking in. It was a sacred venue. The priests were doing their holy rituals, and it wasn't supposed to be open to everybody in the community. It was for the priests. It was sacred actions that were kept apart. So they needed to put up these hangings for privacy, for modesty. But it doesn't mean that Rabbi Eliezer didn't hold that Jerusalem also has eternal sanctity. All right, so you know what? Maybe it's a different Tanaitic dispute. This one is between Rabbi Yishmael. We're going to find out it's between Rabbi Yishmael and himself. There's a Baraita which taught, in which Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, said, why did the sages enumerate only 9 cities in Tractate Arachin as cities walled since the days of Joshua ben Nun? Weren't there a lot more? As when the exiles Keshe'alu v'nei hagola matzu et elu v'kitshum, when the exiles from Babylonia came back to the land of Israel, they had to sanctify these walled cities again. We'll get to a moment. What does that mean? They had to consecrate the walled cities. Aval rishonim batlu mishebat la haaretz. But the sanctity of the first walled cities enumerated in the book of Joshua were meaning that they were negated when the land was exiled. So what does it mean they had to reconsecrate these cities? Well, because once the walled cities lost their holiness, their sanctity, and the rules regarding walled cities, they had to be reconsecrated. And it was only these 9 that were reconsecrated. All the other ones didn't have their sanctity levels yet. So the inference here is that Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, maintained that Kedusha Rishona, the earliest level of sanctity, Kidsha L'Sha'ata, it was sanctified when the people were living in the land of Israel, but it wasn't eternal. You had to do something to bring it back to that level of sanctity. While the people were exiled, they lost that level of sanctity. So what does it mean they lost their level of sanctity? Well, he explains here.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
So the halacha says that they can offer sacrifices in this time.
Right. According to Rabbi Yoshua, he argued, or at least he's saying that he heard from his teachers, that even though the temple was destroyed, they could still offer sacrifices, even though there was no temple, and they could still follow the temple rituals without a temple during this period of time. Now, the Mishnah makes it pretty clear that after the destruction of the temple, there were they didn't have permission to do that, and that's what we follow today. But Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer were both learning from their teachers about this intermediate period. But between the destruction of the tabernacle at Shiloh and the destruction of the destruction of the temple in 70 and I'm getting all confused with the dates. The destruction of the temple in 586, the first destruction, and the rebuilding of the temple, or the start at least of the rebuilding 70 years later. So in this intermediate time, there was permission to offer these sacrifices because, according to Rabbi Yoshua, Jerusalem is sanctified for all time. So they were permitted to make these offerings, even though the Mishnah seems to contradict it, that they couldn't. Jerusalem may have its sanctity forever. It may be a sacred space forever and ever, but they weren't, after the destruction of the second temple, permission to make offerings ended. on a temporary altar.
Okay, so not right now.
Right. So we can't do it right now based on the Mishnah.
Okay.
But these are both teachings that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua received, who were early, who were Tanaim, that it seemed like they had heard different things. But in fact, it's possible that they both held that during this post-temple destruction, at least of the first temple, and before the next one was built, they could eat these sacred offerings. It didn't matter whether there was a temple or not. So now we have a different argument that they're going to try to then bring up to date with the idea of offerings in Jerusalem. So Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yossi argues that because the initial consecration sanctified Jerusalem only for its time and not forever, which is why the returnees had to reconsecrate the walled cities, meaning, and I thought he told us that there was a note here, but in any case, there are rules about walled cities regarding if you sell a place in a walled city, you only have a year to reclaim it. It's unlike the other laws in the Torah of land. If you sell your ancestral land outside of a walled city, because the cities belong to the Levites, if you sell your ancestral land, your tribal land, or your clan's land, after 50 years, it returns. It returns to your clan, it returns to your tribal grouping. You can't sell it forever. But with a walled city, the rules are different. If you sell your property in a walled city, you have a year to reclaim it. If not, it is sold permanently. So this is a Torah law. And so these rules is what Rabbi Yishmael is arguing. These rules went out the window during the period of when the Jews were in Babylonia and they were exiled from their homeland. When they came back, only some of the cities were reconsecrated, and those rules were to be followed again. Meaning that Jerusalem, which is one of the walled cities, during that period of time, it lost its level of sanctity while the Jews were exiled. But then we have a contradiction in a different Baraita, which sounds like it's from the same guy, Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yossi. Were these cities that were enumerated in Tractate Arachin the only walled cities? Wasn't it already stated? 60 cities, all the region of Argob. This is from Deuteronomy. And concerning these cities, it was written, all these cities were fortified by high walls, gates, and bars, indicating that there were a great number of walled cities. Rather, why then did the sages enumerate only the 9 cities? It is due to the fact that when the exiles ascended from Babylonia, they discovered these cities and consecrated them as walled cities. Now, that sounds like the exact same thing that we saw in the first opinion. But the Gemara asks, wait. Was that the language of the second Baraita? They sanctified them, they consecrated them? Didn't they, hashta amar le tzricha le kedusha? Now, didn't they say later in the same Baraita that it's not necessary to consecrate them? Rather, the language in the Baraita was they discovered and enumerated them. So in the second Baraita, it doesn't say that they came back, these exiles came back and they consecrated the walled cities or some of the walled cities. It's simply they enumerated the walled cities. So they were counting them. They discovered them. They found the walled cities again. They enumerated them, but they didn't have to reconsecrate them, because not only these, but in any city with regard to which you receive a tradition from your ancestors, that it was surrounded by a wall from the days of Joshua, son of Nun, all these mitzvot are observed in it due to the fact that the initial consecration sanctified Jerusalem for its time and sanctified Jerusalem forever. So they didn't have to reconsecrate. That's what the second Baraita is suggesting. They didn't need to reconsecrate the walled cities because they were consecrated for all time, or at least Jerusalem was consecrated for all time. And the rules regarding walled cities were followed always, even after the destruction of the first temple, and certainly the Jerusalem. So the problem, wait a minute, this is the problem, because you got one Rabbi Yishmael statement saying where the inference is that cities were not consecrated for all time and they had to reconsecrate them. Then you have the second Baraita in which Rabbi Yishmael said, oh no, they didn't have to reconsecrate them. They just enumerated them. They just counted them. They appointed them as walled cities. Okay. So the Gemara's response is, Trei Tana'ei Liba de Rabbi Yishmael ba Rabbi Yossi. There were two other Tanaim who held according to the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi. And each transmitted Rabbi Yishmael's opinion in a different manner. So in a sense, what it was is Rabbi Yishmael had a view, and the two later Tanaim taught his view in these Baraitot, but they didn't trade, they taught it differently. You know, they got it, and they taught what they thought was the exact tradition, but they actually ended up doing the opposite tradition. They teaching something opposite. And so we don't really know what Rabbi Yishmael's opinion was, but the students of Rabbi Yishmael who taught this view got it completely opposite. That's one possibility. Or you could say that instead of one of the traditions being mistaken, that Rabbi Elazar bar Yossi said it, not Yishmael, not Yishmael bar Yossi, Elazar bar Yossi. Elazar, who was the son of Rabbi Yossi, said in the verse, he taught it this way. Where was the language here? Asher lo choma. This is from the verse in the Torah in Leviticus talking about these different rules for walled cities. Notice in the Hebrew here that lo is spelled lamed vav aleph. Well, there's two. The word lo is a homonym. Lo lamed vav is the pronoun. Asher lo choma, we would translate it as in which there was to it a wall, and lamed aleph lo is no. Then asher lo choma would be in which there wasn't a wall. So by taking these two ways of reading the verse, Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Yossi understands or interprets the verse as indicates that even though it does not presently have a wall, as it was destroyed, but it had a wall previously, it retains its status as a walled city. So because of the way that the word is written with the confusion whether it's lo with a vav or lo with an aleph, he learned from this that even though it didn't have a wall, since it had a wall previously, it retained its status as a walled city. It retained its sanctity as a walled city, and therefore it wasn't Rabbi Yishmael versus Rabbi Yishmael. It was actually Rabbi Yishmael versus his brother. Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Yossi was his brother. He had a different opinion. So it's easier to understand the different opinions in that case. Okay, now we get back to finally the book of Esther. And we have here a lot of different teachings on the verse. What I pointed out in the notes is that what does it mean when it says, so here's the beginning of the book of Esther. Vayihi bimei Achashverosh. In the days of Achashverosh. It was in the days of Achashverosh. Amar Rabbi Levi v'itema Rabbi Yonatan. Davar zeh misoret biyadenu me'anshei Knesset Agdolah. Oh, first we're going to learn this midrash. So we have this ancient tradition goes back all the way to Anshei Knesset Agdolah, the men of the Great Assembly who we've mentioned before. We're not really sure who they were or when they lived or who was in the Knesset Agdolah. But it's this tradition of this bridge group between the prophets and then the named traditions that we have, the named scholars who led the Jewish people, the rabbinic group. Anyway, so this tradition is kol makom shenemar vayihi eino ela lashon sa'ar. Wherever you see the word vayihi at the beginning of a passage, that is bad news. Lashon sa'ar. It is language of grief or suffering. And here we're going to get some examples. Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh. There, well, we know that was Haman. Vayihi b'mei Shafot HaShoftim. This is the beginning of the story of Ruth. Well, at the beginning of the story of Ruth, there was a famine. Vayihi ki hechel ha'adam l'rov. This is from Genesis 6, right? We know that was bad news when God decides to bring a flood after that. Here's some more. Vayihi b'nosam mikeda. That's from the story of the Tower of Babel. Vayihi b'mei Amraphel. This is from the Genesis chapter 14, right before, or this is the story of the war between the 5 kings and the 4 kings. Vayihi b'yod Yoshua b'Yericho v'charbo shlufa b'yado. This is kind of interesting in that this is seen as a negative. It came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, it was there that he saw an angel with his sword drawn in his hand, which was a warning. And if you remember, do we have a note here? This was, remember in Ta'anit, we studied this, that the angel with the sword in his hand criticized Joshua for not studying Torah at night. He was so focused on the war with Jericho that he gave up studying and the nighttime Torah learning. And so the angel was criticizing him. And here's another one. Another Vayihi. Vayihi ish echad min haramatayim. It was, and it came to pass that there was a certain man of Ramatayim. This is the beginning of the Samuel story. And what was the negative there? Oh, Hannah was loved, but she was infertile. So all these negative occurrences that followed of the opening of a narrative that begins Vayihi. The only thing is that some of them are a little bit of a stretch. You know, I mean, it is true that Hannah was infertile, but the point is that she gives birth eventually to Samuel the prophet. But we have some more here, also in Samuel. Vayihi ki zaken Shmuel. When Samuel was old, and one of the things we learned about Samuel was v'lo halchu vanav b'drachav. His sons didn't walk in his way. So even though Samuel was a great prophet and judge, his kids didn't follow his path. Also, Vayihi David lechol drachav maskil v'ranai imo. It came to pass that David was successful in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. But a few verses later, Saul viewed David with suspicion. And here also another Vayihi ki yashav hamelech bebeito. David wants to build the house, and the word that starts the narrative is Vayihi, but he's told you can't build a house. Again, it's a little bit, pushing, right? David was successful. Okay, Saul viewed him with suspicion, but he was successful. So how is that a negative? But okay, it's a little pushing it, but they're trying to find all these examples. Every time they see Vayihi, they want to see something negative. But then here we have the exact opposite though. Wait a minute, we've also got some verses that begin with Vayihi that are very positive. Vayihi b'yom hashmini. And it came to pass on the 8th day, which was the day of the dedication of the tabernacle. This was a joyous day. God, according to Baraita, this was as wonderful as the day that the world was created. It was Yom Hashmini, because the 8th day was when the tabernacle was dedicated. And it came to pass, and here we have another Kativ Hacha Vayihi b'Yom Hashmini v'Uchtiv Hatam Vayihi Boker Yom Echad. So you have Vayihi in both cases. creation story and the dedication of the temple. Oh, but wait a minute. The day that the temple was dedicated, it also was the day that Nadav and Avihu died. So maybe we're still consistent with the positives. Well, wait a minute. We have some other positive examples of Vayehi. Vayehi b'shmonim shana ve'arba me'ot shana. Wasn't it written? It came to pass in the 480th year, which discusses 480th year of what was the 480th year since the temple. Yeah. I see. It's saying the 480th year in which the temple was, since the building of the temple, that's what they were. So Vayehi, that was, they're accounting from the building of the temple. That's a joyous thing. That's wonderful. That's as a anchoring for time, a time marker was the building of the temple. What about Vayehi? Vayehi kasher ra'a Yaakov et Rachel. It came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel. That was a momentous occasion. How about Vayehi erev vayivoker, the creation of the world? That was a positive. There's a lot of examples of Vayehi where something positive happened. Okay, so then we have to redo this. Well, okay, we'll think this through again. Amar Rav Ashi, kol Vayehi ikahachi, ve'ikahachi. He says, Rav Ashi teaches, well, you can go either way with Vayehi, actually. There are some which are introduce a very negative experience, some which introduce a positive experience. However, when you see Vayehi b'mei so-and-so, when you see it came to pass in the days of X, then it's bad news. It's nothing but grief. And here's the examples. We have 5 examples of it in the Torah. Chamisha Vayehi b'mei. Okay, here they are. It came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. Well, that's the one we have here. That's Haman. It came to pass in the days of when the judges ruled. That was because everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel. That was the war between the 4 kings and the 5 kings. It came to pass in the days of Achaz, one of the bad kings. And it came to pass in the days of Jehoiakim. That was the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem. So let's see if they give us any other information.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my question. This Rav Ashi was blind.
Rav Ashi was blind.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Rav Sheshet was blind.
Oh, Rav Sheshet. Okay.
Yeah,
sorry.
I don't know if I don't think Rav Ashi was blind.
Yeah,
So,
he was.
There are. Let's see. Okay. Well, anyway, so let's keep going. So when it says Vayehi b'mei, that leads into a narrative which is going to be very negative. Even though in the Esther story ends up very happily, but for a while there was a little touch and go. Okay. Here's the next one. Amar Rabbi Levi. There's another teaching of Rabbi Levi. Misorat biyadenu me'avotenu. We have a tradition from our ancestors. Amotz ve'amatzia achim havu. So who's Amotz and Amatzia? Well, Amotz is the father of Isaiah. Isaiah, that was the prophet Isaiah ben Amotz. And Amatzia was also a king of Judea. And he says it's a tradition that these 2 guys were brothers, which means that Isaiah would have been the nephew of the king of Judea. My kamashmalan, what do we learn from this? What novel element is this statement teaching us? So, the Amar Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonatan. According to Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, who taught in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, Kol kala shehitznu'a b'veit chamiyah, any bride who is modest in the house of her father-in-law merits that kings and prophets will emerge from her. Now, remember, this was a time when when a couple got married, they usually went and lived in the house of the bridegroom, the groom's home. And so the bride, so it's saying here that this young bride would be in the house of her in-laws. And if she was very modest in the house of her father-in-law, she would merit to have kings and prophets emerge from her. Now, how did we learn this? Well, we learned it from the story of Tamar and Judah. Because as you know, when Judah sees, remember the story, she goes out and pretends to be a prostitute so that she can finally have relations with a close relation, supposed to be of her brother, but she ends up in with the father of her first husband, so that the child will be accorded to the first husband. He sees her and he thought she was a prostitute because she had covered her face. And the question is, can it be that because she covered her face, he thought she was a prostitute? That doesn't seem to make sense, because usually a harlot, I mean, if you're a prostitute, you're trying to get business, so you want to uncover your face. No, what it means is she covered her face in the house of her father-in-law when she was living with Judah and married to Judah's son, not Onan, that was the second one. Who was the first one? Er, that he didn't know what she looked like because she was always covered up. That's why he didn't recognize her. And what happened? She merited that kings and prophets emerged from her. Kings emerged from her through David, who was a descendant of Peretz. Remember, she had two kids. However, there's no explicit mention that she was the forebearer of prophets. This is derived from that which Rabbi Levi said, this matter is a tradition that we received from our ancestors, that Amos, who was the father of Isaiah, and Amaziah were brothers. Thus, but through Peretz, she was the matriarch of David, king, and Amos, who was the brother of a king and the father of Isaiah. So Isaiah his lineage also goes back directly to Tamar. And we have another tradition from Rabbi Levi. Davar zeh misorah b'yadeinu v'alavteinu, makom aron eino min hamitah. That the tradition is the place of the Ark of the Covenant was not included in the measurement of the Holy of Holies in which it rested. Now, my understanding of this is that if you read the Harry Potter books, there's in book 5, the good guys, Harry Potter is I forgot the good guys team was whatever. The good guys had to hide themselves, and they had a home that was their headquarters. But if you looked on the street, it didn't appear. It's only when you had the proper incantation that the home would appear. And so it seemed like it was taking up no space, but in fact, it was actually did have space. You could walk into it, and it was a big house. That's what it seems to be teaching here. The ark crafted by Moses had 10 cubits of empty space on each side. And it's written in the description of Solomon's temple, and before the sanctuary, which was 20 cubits in length and 20 cubits in breadth. The place before the sanctuary is referring to the Holy of Holies. It was 20 by 20 cubits. If there were 10 cubits of empty space on either side of the ark, apparently the ark occupied no space at all. And it is written, and the wing of one of the cherubs was 10 cubits, and the wing of the other cherub was 10 cubits. This is in the Solomon's temple, right? The wings of the cherubs occupied the entire area. If so, where was the ark itself standing? Rather, must one not conclude from it that the ark stood by means of a miracle and occupied no space? All right, so that was kind of interesting in terms of architecture. All right, now we get to this next section, which is very interesting in terms of the language. What does it mean? Rabbi Yonatan patach la pitcha lahai parshata mehacha. They translated, Rabbi Yonatan introduced this passage, the book of Esther, with an introduction from here. Well, as I put in the notes, a lot of times, first of all, these were lectures. Remember, originally everything that we have, this is what we call the oral Torah, because it was taught orally, and sages would teach their material, and they would in a lecture class, right? And they would be lecturing their material like a professor would do, and introducing this passage with an introduction of here. They would very often, if they're teaching a material, this goes for Torah, with many of the midrashim that we have on Torah, as well as other passages, they would begin with a verse out of nowhere. They would just pull this verse out of nowhere that had nothing obviously related to the text that they were teaching, and then they would connect them. And as the two possibilities that I understand for their doing this was, one, to show that all of Torah is connected. Every verse is connected to every other verse, because all of Torah comes from the same source. It all comes from God. And we had this discussion before about what books impurify the hands, meaning what books are either written by God or inspired by God. And therefore, I can find a verse anywhere in Scripture and relate it to any other verse. That's one possibility. The other possibility is, as my teacher, oh come on, sometimes my ability with names. Okay, wait, no, because I've just mentioned him. I gotta make sure I get the. Oh, come on. I can't believe I got the name in Hebrew. I don't have the name in English. Vysotsky, Bert Vysotsky. Well, that's a little embarrassing. Okay, Bert Vysotsky, great scholar of Midrash, a teacher of mine at the seminary, he argues that one of the reasons why they do this is for entertainment. In this sense, not like entertainment we think of today, but and a good lecturer will do this when he does his lectures. You come off with something out of the blue. We're going to talk about the book of Esther. Well, let me start with this verse from Isaiah. What? Huh? And then you've got now you're drawn in. Wait, how is it? What does the Isaiah have to do with Esther? And then the good lecturer is able to bring it together. So we're going to see a number of these examples. Here's from Rabbi Yonatan. I will rise up against them, says the Lord of hosts, and cut off from Babylonia name, remnant, and offspring, and posterity, says the Lord. So he interprets it, name means that the writing of ancient Babylonia will disappear from the world. Remnant, that the language of ancient Babylonia will disappear. Offspring, their kingdom will disappear. And posterity, oh, that's Vashti, because she was supposedly Nebuchadnezzar's granddaughter, and she gets killed. So remember, Ahasuerus, Achashverosh, is a Persian king, and Babylonia, which conquered the land of Israel, according to Isaiah, will eventually be wiped out as well. And so that is in fact what happened. Persia wipes out Babylonia, and that gets us to the Persians, and that gets us to the Esther story. And the one blood relative to the Babylonians, Vashti also dies. So they're totally wiped out. And then he would begin his lecture on the book of Esther. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani had a different approach. He had another verse from Isaiah. The verse says, instead of the thorn shall the cypress come up, and instead of the nettle shall the myrtle come up. Here we go. Instead of the thorn, this means instead of wicked Haman, because he turned himself, Sha'asa atzmo avodah zarah, he's an idol worshiper. And there's this verse, uvechol hanatzutsim. Here's you have to do these Hebrew connections. Tachat hanatzutz. Natsutz, here's the natsutz and natsutz. Another verse in Isaiah says all of the natsutzim, the thorns, and all of the brambles are referred to be supposed to be a reference to idol worship. So Haman was an idol worshiper, and let's see if the Maharsha, this commentary on the Gemara, questions the nature of the Gemara's proof, as there seems to be no indication in the verse that it is discussing idolatry, but he leaves the question unanswered. Perhaps the Gemara's understanding relies on the understanding of Targum Yonatan, that's an Aramaic translation, who explained thorns and brambles to mean houses that are designated for idolatry. Well, the point is, the thorn, which Shmuel Bar Nachmani reads as idolatry, gives way to the cypress. Cypress is a rosh, but that's a play on words with the word rosh, meaning head. So the thorn will give way to the cypress, which is the rosh, and the cypress is the chief of all spices, and that's Mordechai. Mordechai was the head of heads. He was the leader of the Jewish people. So, and just as the cypress was the head or the chief of all the spices, even though it's a play on words, because one is spelled different, their two words are spelled differently, but they're homonyms, Rosh and Rosh. And the nettle, which is in Hebrew the sirpad, means Vashti. He interprets that as Vashti because she was the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Shesaraf, he burned up the temple. So Sirpad has the word saraf in it, or at least a homonym. It's spelled with a samech instead of a sin, but it's a samech to saraf in here. And saraf, so Nebuchadnezzar, who burned up the temple, he was the grandfather of Vashti, and that the Sirpad, so the burner, is replaced by Hadass. And of course, we know Esther's Hebrew name was Hadassah. So you can see there's a lot of work to be done in these interpretations. There are puns upon puns to make sense of it. But again, a good lecturer is going to take you through all of these verses. Here's another one. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi took a verse from Deuteronomy. And it shall come to pass that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do good and to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to cause you to perish and to destroy you. This is from the curses in Deuteronomy, the Tochecha. So here, this is going to be a negative spin on it. Ken yasis lahara etchem. So God will rejoice to do you harm. Now, so first we have a little byway. Is it true that God really rejoices over the fall of the wicked? And here's the interpretation. So Rabbi Yoshua Levi continues this. Isn't it written, as they went out from the army and they say, give thanks to the Lord for his kindness endures forever. That's from Chronicles. Rabbi Yochanan said, for what reason were the words said, for he is good? Now, it doesn't say for he is good, ki le'olam chasdo, for his compassion is forever. Wait, did I get that way? Give thanks to the Lord for his kindness. For what were the words for he is good not stated in the statement of thanksgiving? Because the Holy One, blessed he, does not rejoice over the downfall of the wicked. The song was sung in the aftermath of a military victory, and so therefore the wicked fell. And so they said they changed it from tov, ki le'olam tov, to ki olam chasdo. God is not, God doesn't rejoice over that. And then we have this famous passage that we always recite at Pesach time. What's the meaning of, and when in the Passover story, when the Egyptians are chasing the Israelites, and it says, V'lo karav zeh el zeh kol halayla. The Egyptian camp didn't come close to the Israelites all night long. And it was right before the Egyptians fell in the water and were killed. The ministering angels wanted to sing their song. They were so happy that God had saved the people, and they called out each to each other. This is from Isaiah, the Kadosh, 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 right? But the Holy One, blessed be he, said, they are the work of my hands. Masei yadai tovim bayam. The work of my hands are drowning in the sea, and you want to sing songs? So God doesn't rejoice over the downfall of the wicked. Rabbi Elazar said that this is how the matter is to be understood. God himself does not rejoice over the downfall of the wicked, but he may cause others to rejoice. And that's what the Gemara comments. One can learn this from the language of the verse as well. In the curses, it says ken yasis, not yasus, not that God rejoices, but God causes others to rejoice. And so this is a little bit of an indication. What does it mean? So what is this relation? It doesn't really finish the thought of what's the relationship between the book of Esther and God rejoicing to cause you harm in the verse. Well, the connection, and we're going to see it a little bit more as we go on, is that the reason why Haman was able to be successful as long as he was because the Jewish people were turning away from God and the Torah. And we get to that in a moment. But first we have Rabbi Abaha Bar Kahana. He began his lecture in this way. This is a verse from Ecclesiastes. He gives to a man that is good in his sight wisdom and knowledge and joy. Well, who's this referring to? That is the righteous Mordechai. With regard to the next part of the verse, but to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and heaping up. That's referring to Haman, because the next part of the verse says that he may give it to one who is good before God. So the sinner gathers up all the money, acquires everything, but never gets to enjoy it because God makes sure that people who are good end up with it. And that's the story of Mordechai and Esther. She set Mordechai over the house of Haman. So Haman was, enriched himself through his corruption, but who got to enjoy it? Mordechai, because he triumphed over Haman. Rabbi Bar Opharan introduced this passage with an introduction from here. This is from Jeremiah, I will set my throne in Elam and destroy from there the king and princes, says the Lord. The king who was destroyed, this is referring to Vashti. The princes refers to Haman and his 10 sons. Rav Dimi Bar Yitzhak introduced this passage with an introduction from here. We'll just go a little bit farther. For we are bondmen, yet our God has not forsaken us in our bondage, but has extended mercy unto us in the sight of the kings of Persia. Oh, and so when did this occur? This occurred at the time of Haman. All right, well, we'll get through it. We'll get to the part about the negativity next time on Daf 11, where there is this belief that the Jewish people kind of brought the curse of Haman upon themselves. And so I think that's what up above Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi was getting at. All right, so let's stop the share. Okay, so we'll keep going on with this, so now we're into the interpretation of the verses of the Book of Esther, which should be interesting to see how the rabbis do it and how they translate, how they interpret each of these passages. And of course, it takes them way out of filling in a lot of blanks in the story that sometimes seem pretty fantastical. All right, very good.
All right.
Hope to
Thank
see
you,
you
Rob.
guys tomorrow night. And when we talk about, well, actually this period of time, the Hellenistic period.
One thing about the tabernacle, and it's
Yeah.
not conforming to physics.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different theoretical physicists who have done things about the science of science fiction,
Yeah.
and stuff like the TARDIS in Doctor Who, how it would act, like what the actual math and physics is behind something like that. And the tabernacles fits very well with different theories in quantum mechanics about how
Really?
it would have gone. Yeah, it actually, like, the math mostly checks out as far as how, I mean, it's obviously all theoretical and stuff like that, theoretical physics, but it really does conform to those theories that we hold to now.
That's
with
great.
how things fit but don't fit in our physical world.
Very
So it was
nice.
pretty cool.
Very cool. All right. We'll see you guys hopefully tomorrow or next week.
Yep, I'll see you tomorrow night.
Bye.
Right.